Andor is taking an interesting approach to the Imperial agencies it chooses to show us by focusing pretty heavily on something we've seen in Star Wars before but hasn't really taken center stage. So I figured today we'd take a closer look at the Imperial Security Bureau, or the ISB. I'm Colin, and this is Sci-Fi Deep Dive. Remember, if you enjoyed this video, to head down below and hit that subscribe button. So before I begin, just want to throw out there that this will include some spoilers for Episode 4 of Andor, so if you'd like to avoid those spoilers, but stay on the topic of Andor, I'll leave a link up here to a video I have all about what I hope to see in this show. So let's just jump in with what the ISB is. The ISB, or the Imperial Security Bureau, is one of several secret services operated by the Galactic Empire. The Imperial Security Bureau was specifically tasked with internal security, so their job was mostly hunting down rebel elements and trying to infiltrate rebel cells to gather information. They were sort of like the FBI, if you will, here in the United States. Their entire task is hunting down domestic problems coming from within the Empire, so they would have been the primary intelligence service working actively against the Rebel Alliance. On a side note, there actually are several other Imperial secret services, some of which were focused on external threats. Which external threats they were facing, I have no idea. However, it's likely that when the Galactic Civil War really took off and the Rebel Alliance became a really substantial threat, the focus of basically all of the Imperial security forces would have been on the Rebel Alliance. So we know they're tasked with dealing with domestic threats, but what exactly does that mean? Well, they would have been responsible for finding rebel agents, particularly within Imperial organizations or Imperial allied organizations. As such, ISB officers tend to be in nearly every major Imperial operation. Some of them are not really hiding either. Some of them are wearing their traditional white tunics, their white uniforms. We actually see ISB officers on the Death Star in A New Hope, although they're not immediately identified as that. But it's likely there were members of the ISB on nearly every naval vessel within the Galactic Empire, some of which, like I said, would have been more open about their position in the ISB, but there were almost certainly some that were undercover. And there were ISB agents in nearly every large civilian operation as well, keeping an eye on things and making sure that these operations were going as the Empire desired, and these workers were loyal to the Empire. Many of these would have been more plainclothes in disguise, sort of blending in kind of operations. In fact, it's likely that there were some ISB officers within the ranks of those Preox Morlana sort of headquarters personnel who likely tipped the Empire off before the showdown on Ferrix even happened. Ultimately, the ISB ended up being the Empire's eyes in most situations, especially when it comes to deep infiltration operations and attempting to figure out who's working for the Rebel Alliance. I would wager that we're going to see a lot more of the ISB in the show as well, particularly trying to weed out Imperial senators who may not be super loyal to the Galactic Empire. This is a particular problem for Mon Mothma, and I'm sure it will come up at some point in the show. But just because they are specifically geared towards intelligence gathering and finely trained in clandestine operations doesn't mean they're not willing to get their hands dirty. We see ISB officers getting into combat and being directly involved in engagements with rebel cells, particularly early on. One of the prominent examples of this is Agent Callus from Rebels, who is an ISB agent assigned to hunting down these rebel cells, but we do see him directly engage these rebel units in combat during several instances. This also seems to show a weird position with the ISB when it comes to combat and their position within the Imperial military. It doesn't really make much sense, and it begs the question, where in the military's chain of command does the ISB sit? My assumption is rather high, but we don't know for sure. And there's one more little tidbit I'd like to throw out there about the ISB, and that's a familiar face that many people who've seen the Clone Wars will recognize, who did end up working with the ISB. Admiral Wolf Yularen, who was a prominent admiral during the Clone Wars, serving under General Skywalker during the events of the conflict, ended up serving in the ISB following the rise of the Empire. He was serving with the ISB all the way up to the Battle of Yavin at least, where he likely perished on board the Death Star during its destruction. Ultimately, though, the ISB did play a very interesting role within the Empire and had a very unique position within the events that led to and sort of became the Galactic Civil War. Their entire existence was based around hunting down insurrections and rebellions, which would ultimately become the Empire's downfall. And if you'd like to learn more about the way the Disney canon depicts the collapse of the Empire, which was caused by rebellions and insurrection, I'll leave a link up here to my video on that. And I'd like you to let me know down in the comments whether you think the ISB is really analogous to the FBI, or do you think that's a bad analogy to make? If you had to, would you point to a different intelligence service here in the real world, or do you think there is no real-world counterpart to the ISB? And if you have anything else you'd like to see me cover in Star Wars, leave it down below in the comments. Last but not least, if you enjoyed this video, head down below, hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon so you get notified when I upload new videos. So for Sci-Fi Deep Dive, I'm Colin, and I will see you next time.